Welcome to the Big Four Accounting Firms podcast, brought to you by big4accountingfirms.com. We have a great show today, but before we get to that, I wanted to remind you of a few things. We have 2 great books on Amazon that will help you get the Big Four job that you deserve, and I've included links to those books in the show notes. Additionally, I wanted to remind everyone to make sure that they subscribe to this podcast to stay up to date on the latest Big Four news and career tips. Also, make sure to share the show with a friend if you get a chance. Lastly, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. I'll include links to all our social media in the show notes. Thanks and enjoy the show. Today we are going to be going over interviews at the Big Four and what to expect. So what type of interviews are Big Four interviews? Big Four interviews are typically behavioral style interviews. What this means is that the Big Four try to figure out if you are a right fit for them based on your past behaviors. Since they can't watch videos of how you've acted in the past, they have to ask you questions instead. In order to have success in your Big Four interview, you are going to need to understand how to succeed at behavioral interviews. This means that you will need to be ready to answer many types of behavioral interview questions. And the reason that interviewers are asking behavioral interview questions is because it is harder to answer behavioral questions in an untruthful manner. I can illustrate this by first going over some other types of interview questions. First, there's the very common interview question of, tell me about yourself. This is a terrible interview question, but still many Big Four interviewers will ask you this. It is terrible because it is vague, and you might not learn anything about the interviewee by asking it. The interviewee might just tell you about what they've done in school, or their greatest accomplishments, and how they are a great person. And that is why the Big Four tries to steer their interviewers towards more of a behavioral interview. Another type of interview is situational interviewing and situational interview questions. This is where the interviewer will ask you how you'd react in a certain type of situation. The problem with this type of interview and interview questioning is that the interviewer has no idea whether you'd actually act that way in a certain situation. For example, if an interviewer asked you what you'd do if your staff person was overworked, and you said you'd do all their work for them and make sure they achieve the right work-life balance, how would they know whether you'd actually follow through with that? How do they know that you wouldn't tell the staff to come in on the weekend and overwork them because you are overworked and you are stressed out? They don't know. They would just have to take your word for it. Additionally, if they ask you how you deal with a coworker that yelled at you and yelled at you frequently, and you say you'd spend time to figure out what the problem was, and you do so in a patient and calm manner, when most people would probably get in an argument, you can begin to see how situational interviews aren't the best. That is why the Big Four try to use behavioral interviews. The thought is that it will be hard for you to be untruthful and untruthful to your character. They'll get a better idea of who you are from how you've acted in the past. As the interviewer asks you more questions about your past, they'll pick up on certain behaviors that you've exhibited throughout your stories. They will begin to say things like, what were you thinking at that point? Or, what led you to make that decision? This is why it is important to think of some situations that you've gone through in the past and how you'd construct those in a positive light going into your Big Four interview. You don't want to answer your questions to seem like you always pass the buck or that you like working solo a lot. At the Big Four accounting firms, you will be tasked with a lot of responsibility and you will have to work in teams. So think of great projects that you've worked on in school or at a job where you took on a lot of responsibility or worked well in a team. Begin to craft a story around that is positive so that it comes across well in an interview. If you can give your responses in the form of interesting stories, that's an additional plus because everyone likes a storyteller. Another thing you should try to do in your responses is give your responses in the STAR format. If you've ever been to our resume template page on our website, then you might be familiar with the STAR system. It is more frequently used for resumes, but it is also good for interviews. It stands for situation, task, action, and outcome. And this means that you need to provide your responses with the situation, task, action, and outcome each time. For example, if someone asks you to describe a time you worked well in a team, you don't want to say, I worked at Dairy Queen one summer and I had some coworkers who I shared work shifts with. You want to say something like, I worked at Dairy Queen last summer and we faced a staff shortage one week. I worked with another employee to cover multiple shifts while also increasing customer satisfaction through my positive attitude. And my manager told me that during my time at the Dairy Queen, he saw an increase of 10% in sales versus other comparable periods. Essentially, the more descriptive you are in your responses, the better off they'll be. Just make sure that they put you in a positive light and are consistent. Another thing to keep in mind when interviewing with Big Four firms is to check out their values. As part of the behavioral interview, the Big Four will try to ask you questions that line up with their values. If they are in need of a hardworking employee that can work around the clock, they might ask you how you deal with working a lot and working in stressful situations. If you are interviewing with a group that has a lot of travel, they might ask you how you've dealt with new environments, etc. Keep this in mind as you get ready for your interview, because you could potentially use this to your advantage. If you know that you will be going to a group that works around the clock, then you need to make sure that your answers are in line with being flexible to late working hours. In conclusion, if you are interviewing with the Big Four accounting firms, you will most likely encounter behavioral interview questions. And if you need help with this type of interview, you can check out our Big Four interview questions and answers book on Amazon. I'll include links to our book in the show notes. Lastly, you can also visit our website and visit the Big Four Jobs section on our website to learn some good interview tactics. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.